One of the best known of Aesop's fables is the story of the tortoise and the hare. You know how it goes. There's a tortoise, there's a hare, and the hare is making fun of the tortoise for being so slow. The tortoise gets very irritated by this, and so he finally challenges the hare to a race. The hare, of course, accepts the challenge because he's so much faster than the tortoise. So the race begins. And the hare tears off ahead. He gets so far ahead that when he turns around, he can't even see the tortoise. And so he figures he'll take a nap. And then along comes the tortoise, slowly but surely, passes up the sleeping hare, crosses the finish line, wins the race. And the moral of the story is, slow and steady wins the race. And if you are fast, then don't get cocky and sleep on the job. Jesus told a lot of stories. We call them parables. But unlike Aesop's fables, Jesus' parables are not always easy to understand. Some of his parables are downright puzzling. And I find this parable in Matthew 25, the parable of the talents, to be a rather puzzling parable. On the surface, it may seem simple enough. You have a man who's going to go on a trip. He gives 3 servants various amounts of money, talents. A talent is a weight of silver. And then when he comes back, he wants to see what they've done with that money. And the 3rd servant who buried his 1 talent gets thrown out into the outer darkness. But what does this story mean? The fact is, Christians over the centuries have interpreted this parable in a lot of different ways. So, for instance, I know a church where they used this parable for a fundraising drive. The pastor gave a sermon on this parable, and then at the end he gave to everybody in the congregation, every household got some cash. And then he said to them, okay, now you take that cash and you make more cash with it. And then come back here in 2 months and we'll put all that money in our fundraising effort. And so people went and they used that cash to buy lemonade milk mix and plastic cups and set up a lemonade stand and sell lemonade, and they multiplied their money. Or some other people, they took the money, went to a craft store and bought some beads and cords and maybe some fabric and glue and glitter, and they made things, and then they sold those things at a flea market, and they multiplied the money. In any case, a couple months later, everybody in the congregation brought their money back and all the money that they had made, and they had increased it, multiplied it several times, and they had this wonderful fundraiser for the church. But is that what this parable is about? Is it about fundraising for the ministry of the church? I'm not against fundraisers for the church, but is that what this parable is about? Is this parable about the benefits of capitalism? Does the 3rd servant get thrown out into the outer darkness because he doesn't participate in capitalism? I don't think that's what this parable is about. Now, I know another church that used this parable as a basis for recruiting volunteers. So again, the pastor did a sermon on this parable and then ended by saying, okay, now we need you to use your talents for the church. We need to fill various volunteer positions. We need people to be song leaders and play piano and worship leader. We need people to serve on committees. We need people to teach Sunday school classes. We need people to be doing a variety of things, cooking meals for the church. So what is your talent that God has given you? And use that talent now for the church. Is that what this parable is about? Now again, I'm all for the church filling its volunteer positions, helping people to identify their gifts and using those gifts, but I'm not so sure that this parable is actually about that. So what is this parable about? And to be honest with you, I'm not really quite sure. But I'll share with you 3 possible interpretations of this parable. All right, here's interpretation number one. It could be that this parable is a warning to Jesus' followers not to become lax in their discipleship. It could be that Jesus, in effect, was saying to his disciples, I'm going to be going on a long trip. I'm going to be gone. And it'll be a while before you see me again. And in the meantime, what are you going to do? Will you be taking the good news, the talents that I've given you, the treasure of the kingdom, and will be you using that to multiply the kingdom, to make more disciples, and to teach those disciples to do everything that I've taught you? Now that could be what this parable is about. And it could be that the third servant is someone who takes the good news and buries it and does nothing with it. And if you're going to do that, well, you're just not part of the kingdom if you're doing that. Now that may be what this parable is about. In fact, I would say it's likely that's how Matthew interpreted this parable. But let me share a second interpretation, very different. It could be that this parable is meant to be a criticism of an economic system in which the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. Have you ever been bothered about what happens to that third servant who buried his one talent in the ground? Have you ever felt like he was treated unfairly? Have you ever identified with him and said, I think I would have done the same thing? I know I have felt that way. I have always felt that way about this third servant. I mean, if some rich guy gives me a pile of money and then says, I'm going to go on a long trip, you take care of this money for me, I'm not going to turn around and gamble that money on the stock market. What if my investments don't pay off? What if at the end of this guy's trip he comes back and maybe he gave me $10,000 and I can only give him $4,000 back because my investments didn't pan out? I think I'd be in a lot of trouble. It seems to me it's the third servant who does the most prudent, sensible thing. He takes that money and he puts it in the ground where it's going to be safe. Because, that's what you did in the ancient world. If you wanted your money to be safe, you buried it in the ground. That was the safest place for it. That's exactly what this third servant is doing. What's he doing wrong? Now, so I think it's possible that in this parable, the third servant is actually the one who does the right thing, but he gets in trouble for doing the right thing. Pay attention to how the third servant describes his master. He says to him, Master, I knew that you were a harsh man, reaping where you did not sow, and gathering where you did not scatter. So I was afraid. Now, does that sound like a description of a good master? It sounds like somebody who's exploitive. It sounds like a rich guy who exploits others in order to increase his own wealth. And what I find fascinating is that the master doesn't disagree with that description. He says, you wicked, lazy slave, you knew, did you, that I reap where I did not sow and gather where I did not scatter? He's agreeing with him. Yeah, you're right. I'm making money even though I'm not doing any work. And then the master goes on to say, well, then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and on my return I would have received what was my own with interest. Except in the book of Deuteronomy, it forbids Israelites from loaning out money at interest. Interest was considered another form of exploitation in the ancient world. And so really what the third servant has done then is he's refusing to break Moses' laws. He's refusing to be part of the master's program of exploiting other people in order to increase his own wealth. So maybe this third servant is doing the right thing. The parable itself kind of has a little formula, what the meaning of the parable is. It says here, to all those who have, more will be given, and they will have an abundance. But from those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away. Now, does that sound like a fair system to you? The rich get richer, the poor get poorer. So maybe this is a criticism of the economic system. Maybe. But there's a third possible interpretation of this parable. When Jesus traveled from town to town, he often told people, "Come, follow me." But in order to follow Jesus, they had to leave everything else behind. They had to leave behind their jobs. They had to leave behind their homes, their families. They had to leave behind their wealth in order to follow Jesus. Could it be that this parable is about what it takes to follow Jesus? What it takes to be engaged in bringing God's reign here on earth? Could this be a parable about how we need to risk everything to follow Jesus? Being a Christian is not comfortable. Following Jesus is not safe. The Christian faith is not a moderate faith. If we want to be part of God's reign, as that reign is advancing and dawning here in our world, then we have to be willing to put everything on the line to follow Jesus. We need to be willing to risk everything to follow Jesus. To love your neighbor as yourself, to take that seriously, is to risk everything. To love your enemies, to do good to those who hate you, to bless those who curse you, to pray for those who mistreat you. That is to engage in a course of action that we believe multiplies God's reign on earth. But it's risky. It's a risky business, this kingdom business. But that's what faith is. Trust in God and take the risk.